In 1969, Ford panicked. Chrysler had just built a car so fast, it broke 200 miles per hour in NASCAR. And Ford didn't have an answer. They built the most desperate vehicle in history. A car so rare, only 3 were ever made. And before it ever raced, it was killed. By the late 1960s, NASCAR was no longer a gentleman's sport. It wasn't about lightly modified street cars. It wasn't about brand loyalty alone. It was about dominance. The manufacturers weren't just competing on track. They were competing in showrooms. And the late 60s were the most aggressive period Detroit had ever seen. Horsepower was climbing. Cubic inches were growing. But something more sophisticated was happening beneath the surface. Engineers were starting to understand that raw power wasn't enough anymore. At 180 miles per hour, wind resistance becomes a wall. At 190, it becomes an enemy. And at 200, it becomes everything. Chrysler realized this first. The Dodge Charger Daytona didn't look normal. It wasn't meant to. That pointed nose wasn't for style. It was for airflow. The wing wasn't decoration. It was stability. And when Buddy Baker drove that Daytona past 200 miles per hour at Talladega in 1969, it wasn't just a milestone. It was a warning shot. Because 200 miles per hour in a stock car changed perception. It proved that NASCAR wasn't just racing anymore. It was engineering warfare. Ford watched this unfold in real time. And for a company that prided itself on racing heritage, watching Chrysler take that headline hurt. Because this wasn't a narrow win. It was a public humiliation. Inside Ford's racing division, there was tension. They had invested heavily in NASCAR. The Torino Talladega had been their attempt to clean up airflow. But it was subtle compared to the Daytona. Subtle doesn't win wars. When Plymouth introduced the Superbird in 1970, it confirmed something. Chrysler wasn't experimenting. They were committed. The Superbird was as extreme as the Daytona. Same towering wing, same extended nose, same aerodynamic philosophy. And it worked. Drivers could stay in the throttle longer. The cars were stable at insane speeds. The visual alone was powerful. Kids taped pictures of them to bedroom walls, dealers bragged about them, and Ford suddenly felt outdated. That's the part people don't talk about. Ford didn't lack horsepower. They lacked presence. They lacked shock value, and shock value sells. So when Ford executives reviewed race footage, when they saw Mopar cars walking away on the straights, when they saw headlines celebrating 200 miles per hour, they realized something. They were reacting, not leading. And that's a dangerous position for an industry giant. The response had to be dramatic, but Ford didn't want to bolt on a cartoon wing. They believed they could outthink Chrysler. Instead of adding vertical aero, they pursued smoothness. The 1970 Mustang Boss 429 became the foundation, and that was significant. The Boss 429 wasn't an ordinary Mustang. It was already a homologation special. Ford had built it specifically to qualify the 429 engine for NASCAR competition. The engine itself was a monster. Huge ports, aluminum heads, massive breathing capability. If you've been watching the channel, we covered all of this. Official horsepower numbers were conservative. In race trim, these engines were beasts. Now the engine could get a new body. Engineers reshaped the front end. The King Cobra nose extended outward in a rounded form. Low, bulbous, almost strange looking. It didn't look aggressive in the traditional sense. It looked calculated. The idea was to reduce drag coefficient dramatically. No sharp edges, no exposed grill openings, just smooth airflow. 3 prototypes were built. 3 slightly different attempts at solving the same problem. Each one an experiment in desperation. Because that's what this was. Desperation. Ford wasn't experimenting for fun. They were responding under pressure. On paper, the King Cobra made sense. In controlled conditions, it was promising. But NASCAR tracks are unpredictable. They're not wind tunnels. They're violent environments. At nearly 200 miles per hour, even small aerodynamic imbalances become dangerous. Drivers testing the King Cobra reported that the nose reduced drag effectively, but it created lift. The front end felt light at high speed, not wildly unstable, but not planted. And at that level of competition, not planted is unacceptable. The Daytona and Superbird looked outrageous, but their tall wings created their downforce. They were stable. Ford's cleaner approach sacrificed some of that stability. Engineers scrambled. They experimented with spoiler adjustments. They studied balance shifts. They considered adding more rear aero, but development takes time, and the season wasn't waiting. Meanwhile, something bigger was unfolding behind the scenes. The Aero Wars had escalated beyond what NASCAR leadership was comfortable with. Costs were rising, speeds were climbing, safety was becoming a concern. When cars pushed 200 miles per hour with 1960s safety technology, people take notice. NASCAR made a decision. For 1970, and especially into 1971, they introduced engine restrictions for aero cars. If a manufacturer built an extreme aerodynamic body, they'd be forced to run smaller engines, and that changed everything. The Daytona and Superbird lost some of their edge, and Ford's King Cobra suddenly looked like a solution to a problem that was disappearing. Why perfect a radical body if the rulebook just eliminated its advantage? That's when Ford stepped back. They evaluated the cost, the timing, the shifting landscape, and they pulled the plug. Quietly. 3 prototypes, no production run, no homologation push. The war ended before their counterstrike landed. The King Cobra wasn't slow. It wasn't ridiculous. It wasn't a failure in the traditional sense. It was unfinished. Given more development time, it might have stabilized. Given one more season under the old rules, it may have competed. But motorsports history isn't kind to almost. The King Cobra represents a fork in the road, a moment where Ford reacted instead of initiated, a moment where rule changes ended a war before it reached its full peak. And today, the 3 surviving King Cobras aren't just rare. They're symbols of escalation, of corporate pride, of desperation. They weren't built calmly, they were built urgently, and that urgency is what makes them fascinating. The King Cobra never got its race. It never had its Daytona moment, but it tells a story that's just as powerful, because sometimes the most interesting cars in history are the ones that never crossed the starting line. If you appreciate the cars that were built in panic, built in pride, and quietly erased, subscribe, because this wasn't the only one.